everyone. So I think we can start our lecture today, which is the national key environmental issues in Sri Lanka. So what I will do is I will go through some of the major environmental issues that we face in Sri Lanka, just to give you an idea of what these are. Okay. There's a screen there, but I can't see it from here, so I have to turn this way, sorry. Now, when you look at the constitution of Sri Lanka, you can see that environment, the subject of environment has been given a priority in Sri Lanka, because if you look at the constitution of Sri Lanka, it says that Article 27 of the constitution states that the state shall protect, preserve and improve the environment for the benefit of the community. So you can see that the government, the state, has given an important place to the preservation of the environment. But also, if you look at Article 28F, you can see that it states that the exercise and enjoyment of rights and freedoms is inseparable from the performance of duties and obligations. And it is accordingly the duty of every person in Sri Lanka to protect nature and conserve its riches. So you can see that although the constitution says that the state has a duty to protect the environment, it also says that each and every one of us also has a duty to protect the environment. So this is something about the environment, because most people think that environmental protection should be done by the Central Environmental Authority or some such agency like that. But it is actually all of us are responsible for protection of the environment. And as engineers, I think you all have a very big role in environmental protection. If you look at environmental protection in Sri Lanka, the legal status, in Sri Lanka there are a multitude of laws, and actually you can count more than 100 laws which deal with some aspect or the other of environmental management or protection. Now I am not saying that all these 100 are dealing only with the environment. They may be dealing with other things like urban, urban planning or various other subjects. But there is in most of these laws there is something on environmental protection and management. So that is why we have so many laws which deal with the subject of environment. And some of the earliest environmental legislation dates back to the last century really, during the time of the British. So some of the laws that we have, for example, if you look at the forest ordinance, it is more than 100 forestry and protection of high elevation. There's a law like that. So these laws are more than 100 years old. So you have some very old legislation in this regard. Now I said that there are more than 100 laws dealing with the subject of environment. But actually the National Environmental Act number 47 of 1980 is the first comprehensive piece of legislation which deals exclusively with the subject of environmental protection and management. So actually you have to actually deal with the National Environmental Act, which deals exclusively with environmental protection and management. But you can see that the National Environmental Act is a relatively new law, because it was brought in 1980. So if you compare with most of the laws, this is a relatively new act. Now let's see what are the agencies that deal with environmental issues. We have several agencies which are dealing with environmental issues. First we have the Coast Conservation Department. Then you have what is called the Marine Pollution Prevention Authority. Now it has a new name, Marine Environmental Protection Agency. It has a new name, but it's the same thing. Then of course you have Sustainable Energy Authority, Central Environmental Authority, Forest Department, Department of Wildlife Conservation, and in Sri Lanka we also have a separate environmental authority in the northwestern province. So other than the Central Environmental Authority which is in Colombo, there is another provincial environmental authority in the Northwestern Provincial Council. So these are basically the agencies that deal with environmental protection and management in Sri Lanka. Now, when you talk about environment, there are two different types of, when you talk about environmental protection, most people in Sri Lanka think that environmental protection is like environment, the subject of environment is like, something to do with green, like planting trees, that kind of thing. But really when you take the subject of environmental protection and management, it's a very technical kind of subject, because it not only deals with green, what we call green issues. Green issues are things like, for example, forestry, wildlife, biodiversity, those are actually what we call green issues. And in Sri Lanka, most of the time we are talking about green issues. But when you talk about environmental management and protection in most other countries, you always have to talk about what we call the brown issues. Brown issues are, for example, things like water pollution control, air pollution control, industrial pollution control, hazardous waste management, etc. So when you are talking about environmental management and protection, you have to talk about both the green and the brown issues. Because most of the time here in Sri Lanka, when you talk about environment, you always think of tree planting, the green cover, forests, etc. But there is much more to environment than the green part of it. Now, if you look at the forest and wildlife conservation, if you take the forest department and the Department of Wildlife Conservation together, right, these two departments control more than 1.9 million hectares in Sri Lanka. So most of the land in Sri Lanka either is being managed by either the forest department or the Department of Wildlife Conservation. You can see that they control a huge amount of land between the two agencies. So most of the time when you are doing projects, you always come across either the forest department or the wildlife department or the lands that they are controlling. Especially when you are doing large scale projects like irrigation projects or highway projects or any large scale projects, you always tend to take up some land which belongs to either most of the time it's the forest department, because forest department has the most amount of land, and you will always come across lands which have been managed by these departments. Now the forest department's main function is to conserve forests and also to conserve the biological diversity of the country. So it's a very important role that the forest department is playing. If any one of you all saw the Daily Mirror today, I think they have just put out a report from some university in the United States that the extinction phase of this earth has already started. From their studies, they are conclusively saying that this planet is going into its extinction phase. For example, now the last extinction phase was millions of years ago. So now from the rate of destruction of biodiversity in the planet, they have made the conclusion, that report has made the conclusion that we have entered the 6th phase of extinction, right? So this is a very serious issue really, because none of us really take it seriously when people say, even when they talk about climate change, people are still saying, oh, climate change, they just talk about it, it's really not really happening. There are some people who say that climate change is not really happening. But there are scientists who have proved that climate change is in fact happening. And actually in May or March of this year, the concentration of carbon dioxide just passed the level of 400 ppm, which is a very high level, right? So in March or May, I think, it passed this level of carbon dioxide, which is the highest that has been recorded in the planet. So you can see that although we may not feel it when we are living in Sri Lanka or anywhere in the world, actually you don't feel it suddenly, but you can see the planet is actually going into its into extinction. I mean, it's not going to happen in the next 20 years, but it will definitely happen because they have predicted it from the way the biological diversity is disappearing. It has become so fast that the biodiversity is disappearing. So now Forest Department's main function is to conserve forests and biological diversity. And the Department of Wildlife Conservation, their function is to protect the nation's indigenous fauna and flora. And also they have the responsibility of the establishment of national reserves and sanctuaries. So this is one of the responsibilities of the Wildlife Department. Now let's look at the history of the Central Environmental Authority, because the Central Environmental Authority is the agency that is vested with the responsibility of protecting and managing the environment in Sri Lanka. Of course, as I told you, there are many other agencies, but one of the main agencies is the Central Environmental Authority. So the now CEA, or the Central Environmental Authority, was set up in 1981. This was 1 year after the National Environmental Act was passed in 1980. So the CEA, or the Central Environmental Authority, was set up to implement the provisions in this Act, the National Environmental Act. So at the inception, the Central Environmental Authority was only a coordinating and a policy making body. It didn't really have any kind of powers to control the environment. But after about 8 years, the CEA realized that they couldn't do anything very much unless they have what is called regulatory powers. So the National Environmental Act was amended in 1988, and the Central Environmental Authority was transformed into what we call a regulatory agency. So through that, the Central Environmental Authority can control certain things in order to protect the environment. So that is the history of the Central Environmental Authority. Now let's look at some of the major issues, major environmental issues in Sri Lanka. Okay, so this is not really written in any kind of order, but I have just listed them down. One of the major issues, of course, in urban areas is municipal solid waste management, that is garbage. So the garbage problem is a serious problem in Sri Lanka. Then we have another issue of the erosion of the coast, especially in the southwest coast. There is a lot of coastal erosion. So that is another major issue in Sri Lanka. Then we also have water pollution, especially inland water bodies have been polluted. Of course, industrial pollution also, but mainly from sewerage. Right? If you look at any river water, you won't see very much industrial pollution, but you will definitely see pollution from sewerage. Then, of course, we also have air pollution. So although the situation in Sri Lanka is not too bad, actually, the air quality in Sri Lanka is quite good, actually. But there is a certain amount of air pollution, mainly in urban areas, due to pollution from vehicle emissions. So the main cause of air pollution is due to vehicle emissions, and this is also mainly in the urban areas. Then we also have waste management, especially hazardous waste management. Right? When I say hazardous waste management, it means waste arising from industrial operations as well as things like hospital waste, because even hospital waste is considered to be a hazardous waste. And hospital waste management in Sri Lanka is really bad, actually. There is not much of a system at all in most of the, there is some system in the hospitals in Colombo, because there are private companies now who are dealing with this hospital waste. But in outside areas, the hospitals, the way they deal with hospital waste is really, I mean, there's a lot more to be done. Because they don't really manage it, they just bury it or do something like that. So you have to address this problem of hazardous waste management. Then we also have the problem of inappropriate siting of industry. This is of course a major problem, especially in urban areas. If any of you are living in Moratu or Ratmalana, you can see a lot of residential houses next to very hazardous industries like even the asbestos industry. It's in Ratmalana, which is a very populated area, and asbestos is a well-known cancer-causing agent, and it's already banned in many countries, but in Sri Lanka also we are still using it. But the main thing is that near the asbestos industry you can see so many residential houses. So this is what we call inappropriate siting of industry. So that is also a problem in Sri Lanka. Then something that we always read in the newspapers in recent times is the human-elephant conflict. That is the conflict between humans and elephants. Now this is mainly due to the large-scale development projects that are taking place in Sri Lanka. So we are taking over the land that has been occupied by the elephants. So naturally there is a human-elephant conflict. So that is a major issue in recent times. Then of course we have soil erosion and also deforestation, which have been problems for a very long time. Now let's look at this municipal solid waste management in Sri Lanka. So as I told you, the municipal solid waste management is a major issue in mostly urban areas. It's not much of a problem in rural areas, but in urban areas definitely it's a huge problem. Even in Colombo you can see, now you don't really see very much waste along the road. That is true, because there's a good collection system. But there is a very big problem of disposal of this waste, because when you collect this waste you have to finally dispose of it somewhere. And right now what they are doing is they are taking this waste, all the waste, to Kolonnawa, and there's a huge mountain of waste there, and they are just dumping it onto that mountain of waste. So day by day that mountain keeps growing, and you can see, you must have seen on television and newspapers how the people in that area are protesting, that they just can't live in that area due to the bad odor and the flies and so many issues, right? So but now this is the way that solid waste is being managed in Sri Lanka, and it is actually not being managed because they are just going and dumping it at some place. That is not how you manage solid waste. In other countries, when you collect waste, you dispose of it in what are called sanitary landfill sites, and you don't actually see the waste at all. Now if you go to a more developed country, even if you go to Korea or someplace, they collect their waste and dump it in, dispose of it in these sanitary landfill sites. And every day what they do is they compact the waste and they cover the waste with a layer of soil. So if you go to that landfill site in Korea or any other country really, you don't see a waste dump. You only see it's more like a garden or a park, because they have covered it with soil, and the parts that are full of waste, they turn it into some kind of they landscape it and make it into a beautiful garden. So you will never see mountains of waste like we see in Sri Lanka. So this is a major issue in Sri Lanka, because we don't really manage our waste very well. So in Colombo, even in cities where collection is done properly, now in Colombo actually the collection is being done properly, final disposal is always a problem, because you don't really have sanitary landfill sites in Sri Lanka, that's why. In Colombo, final disposal of waste is causing a major social and political issue. Now I was talking about the issue in Kolonnawa, it has become a major political issue also, because the people in that area are really protesting. And all the waste disposal sites in Sri Lanka are what we call dumps, as opposed to sanitary landfill sites which have been used in other countries, right? So we don't manage our municipal solid waste very well. Now there is something positive in more recent times, because the very first sanitary landfill site has been opened, has been opened in Dompe. In Dompe, the Central Environmental Authority got Korean assistance to develop what we call a sanitary landfill site, right? there is a project called the Pilisaru project implemented by the Central Environmental Authority, which has been assisting a lot of local authorities in Sri Lanka to manage their waste. So this Pilisaru project has assisted a whole lot of local authorities to compost their waste that they collect, because most of the waste that they collect is biodegradable and it can be turned into compost. So actually I think the CA has assisted more than 100 local authorities to turn that waste into compost. So they have constructed composting plants for these local authorities. And the Pilisaru project has also developed with Korean assistance the first sanitary landfill site in Sri Lanka. Now, I was talking also about hazardous waste being a problem in Sri Lanka. So this is also a problem. We also have a municipal waste problem. Municipal waste, of course, is generally not we don't call it a hazardous waste, but definitely there is hazardous waste in Sri Lanka, which is coming from mostly industries as well as hospital waste. Now, the Central Environmental Authority has actually gazetted. There is a gazette notification indicating what kind of waste is considered as hazardous waste. So if you look at this gazette notification, you can see what kind of wastes are classified as hazardous waste. And any kind of waste that is classified as a hazardous waste, you can't just simply dump it on the ground or anywhere, or even in a landfill site. You have to manage it in a proper way. You have to actually treat it and make it non-hazardous before you dump it, before you dispose of it somewhere. So hazardous waste also includes hospital waste, as I told you, and a majority of the hospitals in Sri Lanka don't dispose of their waste properly. But now there are private companies who take the hospital waste and they treat it in such a way that all the hazardous nature of the waste is gone. They kill all the bacteria, etc., and then it becomes a normal waste. So then you can even dispose of it even in a normal landfill site. So now there are private companies which are doing this, and most of the hospitals in Colombo are giving this waste to this private company. Now when it comes to hazardous waste, you find that a lot of industries do not properly dispose of their hazardous waste, right? What they do is, most industries, even industries which are generating waste which are hazardous nature, they just give it to some contractor who just goes and dumps it in somewhere. Now recently there was a case where there was a industry which was manufacturing batteries, and the kind of waste that was coming out from that industry was highly hazardous because it had a lot of heavy metals in it, right? And heavy metals are known to be very toxic to human beings, right? And it also accumulates in the body of humans. So when you deal with when you deal with heavy metals like lead or cadmium, those are called heavy metals, you have to be very careful on how you dispose of it. Now there was this battery factory in Colombo somewhere, and they used to give their waste to a contractor. Of course, this industry did not bother to find out where this contractor was going and dumping this waste. And this contractor was taking this waste to his own land somewhere in Horana, and he was just dumping it in his own land. And he was doing this for several years or months. And when the neighborhood, all the neighboring wells, the neighbors started to complain that their wells, that they couldn't drink the water from those wells. So what has happened is the man was dumping the hazardous waste with all the heavy metals on his land, and it was leaching into the groundwater, and it was getting into the wells. And finally, that company had to pay actually compensation and also provide a water supply scheme for those people. Because finally, even though he has given it to the contractor, it's not the contractor who is finally responsible. The industry is held responsible for what they have done. So if an industry is just carelessly disposing of their waste by giving it to some contractor, you can't say that the industry is free from that responsibility, because you have to ensure that the contractor goes and dumps it in a proper way. You can't just say, oh, I gave it to this contractor to take it away, I don't know what he did. So your responsibility does not end. I don't know whether any of you are working in any industries. But this is just to illustrate what has happened some time back. So it can be quite dangerous if you dispose of your waste in a haphazard manner, because it can cause groundwater pollution. So now in Sri Lanka, of course, there is only one place where industries which are generating hazardous waste can get it destroyed. That is, they can give it to Holcim, which is a cement plant, and in the cement plant they have a very high temperature kiln. And the Holcim, they are also doing a business, I mean they are making cement, but they are also accepting hazardous waste to be burnt in their kiln. So some industries are giving their hazardous waste to this Holcim to be destroyed. But only about 20% of the total amount of hazardous waste is going to Holcim, and the other 80% nobody knows where it goes, because the industries are just disposing of it. So it's a dangerous kind of situation. So now if you compare Sri Lanka, of course, with highly developed countries, the quantity that we generate is relatively small. But of course, in time to come, this will become quite a serious problem unless we have some kind of facility to treat this waste. If you have any questions, you can, stop your hand or anything like that, because otherwise it's quite boring to listening to a lecture, and it's more interesting it's more interesting for me also when you ask some question. Otherwise I just say, tell what is in the lecture and you just write it down, and I don't think that's how you should really do it. So one of the other problems we have, of course, is the inappropriate siting of industry. Now, inappropriate siting of industries can also result in pollution problems and nuisance, right? Now in Sri Lanka, mostly this inappropriate siting of industry is mainly through very small scale cottage type of industries. Because what people do, they just start a small industry behind the back of their house. They might start making some polythene bags or some small thing behind their house, right? And at the beginning, nobody really notices even that they are doing anything. But with time, when the business gets going, they try to expand. And then, of course, all the neighbors, I mean, it is a very big nuisance. If you have an industry right next to your house, it can be a very big nuisance for the neighbors. So in Sri Lanka, in the Central Environmental Authority, I know when I was there, we used to get a lot of complaints about this kind of issue, where a small scale industry has started an industry in their house, in the back of their house or something, and so this has become a huge problem. So more than the large scale industry, it's actually the small scale cottage type of industry that is causing problems in Sri Lanka. So as I said, industry may start in a house, thereby causing a nuisance to neighbors. But if you take bigger industries, they usually go through what we call a site approval. They usually get a site approval from the CEA and also the local authority. So there is some kind of approval procedure for larger scale industries. But small scale industries, they don't really bother. They just go and start an industry wherever they want. And then there are major issues after that. Now, there is actually a government policy that high polluting industries should always be sited within industrial estates. Now, this policy has been taken because most large scale industries can cause quite a lot of pollution. Now, recently, you all would have heard about this Ratu Paschala. It's a huge dip products industry. I mean, this product factory. They were producing gloves, and I think it's the third largest factory in the world, I think, which is manufacturing gloves, and it was earning millions of foreign exchange. Very large scale industry, But what happened was the people in that area started actually complaining that their well water was getting polluted. And anyway, finally, things got really bad, and actually the industry, of course, it became a political issue after that. In that case, I am not 100% sure that the pollution was due to that factory, because people are saying that the well water in their houses was acidic, and actually the water in that area was acidic. pH was about maybe 4 or 5. It was quite acidic, but actually the well water in that area is naturally acidic because there is something to do with the soil in that area. So it was not, you could really not prove that it was the industry that was causing the acidity in the industry. But of course, it became such a big political issue, and sometimes politicians don't really understand these scientific issues, and they actually listen to what the people are saying more than the scientists or the agencies, what the agencies are saying. So finally it became such a big issue that this industry, which was earning millions of dollars in to the foreign exchange, had to relocate. And of course they did a good thing, they relocated into an industrial estate. So now there is no issue in that area because the people are not complaining. But I am sure the well water is still acidic because that well water in that area is anyway naturally acidic. So I don't think there is any improvement in the well water, but I think it was, they say that it was some employees who had been, who went on strike, and they had stopped their work or something, and they are the ones who had, got together with the residents around the industry and created this problem. So that's what they say. I don't know. I can't really say what the cause is because I was not, I don't have all the data, but this is what I have heard. And anyway, that huge big industry had to relocate into an industrial estate. So basically what we are saying is that functioning within an industrial estate is always safer for an industry rather than just being outside an industrial estate, especially for high polluting industries. But one of the problems we have is that we do not have sufficient industrial estates in Sri Lanka. So although we have a policy saying all high polluting industries must go into industrial estates, we don't have enough industrial estates. So that's the issue really. And also some industrial zones, even BOI zones, don't really have sufficient infrastructure. For example, things like waste treatment facilities, they don't have. So if you are having an industrial estate, of course, you must have the facilities that go with it, like waste treatment, etc. You have to have those facilities, otherwise industries are not going to come there. There's a mosquito. So now when you talk about water pollution, pollution of water bodies is mainly from what we call non-point sources, or example things like sewerage. But you find that in Sri Lanka some industries discharge untreated wastewater into water bodies even now, right? For example, if you take natural rubber processing industries, there are some industries which are just discharging their wastewater into water bodies, right? But you find that pollution due to chemicals or industrial effluents is not really a widespread issue in Sri Lanka. Now this Ratupashala, of course, was a unique case. I talked about it to you. So there, of course, there is no real proof that the industry was the cause of the pollution. But there are other industries which are definitely causing water pollution. Now, one of the solutions, of course, to this industrial waste problem is to have waste treatment plants, right? Now, in Sri Lanka, there were two areas where there was a very high number of industries, that is Moratu Ratmalana and also in Ekala and Jayala. Right? These are two areas where there is a very high concentration of also high polluting industries, because now especially if you take Moratu or Ratmalana, some years, maybe 40 to 50 or even more than 50 years ago, the government of that time decided that they are going to have industrial estate in Moratu and Ratmalana. And a lot of industries are established in Moratu and Ratmalana. Then subsequently, of course, a lot of people came and started living in and around Moratu and Ratmalana. So that is why even now today, you find highly hazardous industries right next to residential areas. So this is not at all a acceptable thing, but of course it just happened like that. So one of the problems that these industries that were established in Moratu, Ratmalana and Ekala Jayala had was, these industries were established 40-50 years ago, and at that time there was no Central Environmental Authority, there was no National Environmental Act, there was no Urban Development Authority, and there were no laws or regulations for industries to follow. So now, according to the National Environmental Act, there are gazette regulations that say that industries have to treat their wastewater. For example, if they are discharging wastewater into a river or even the sea, you can't just dispose of it the way it is. You have to treat it up to a certain standard. And there are gazette notifications which specify how much cadmium there can be in the wastewater, or how much BOD. BOD is a kind of measure that measures the pollution load of the wastewater. So the gazette notification specifies all these standards. So industries can't just dispose of their waste, they have to treat the waste up to a certain standard. Now one of the problems that these industries in Moratu, Ratmalana and also Ekala Jayala had was, these industries were established about 40-50 years ago when these regulations are not there. So when these regulations came in 1990, these industries found that a lot of them didn't even have space to put up a treatment plant, because you need a lot of space for treatment plants. Then other industries, of course, they didn't have the finances to put up treatment plants, because the treatment plant costs, sometimes it can go up to millions and millions of rupees. So there was an issue in Moratu and Ratmalana and also Ekala and Jayala, that these industries could not treat their waste due to various problems. So actually the government has set up 2 common waste treatment plants in Moratu, Ratmalana and also in Ekala and Jayala. So all the industries in that area can now connect up to this common waste treatment plant, and which has been run by the National Water Supply and Drainage Board, and then this wastewater is treated and disposed into the sea. So that is, because the waste is been treated, it can be discharged into the sea without causing much pollution. So only recently these 2 treatment plants have come up, and only now there is actually a solution for this problem. This problem was there for about 20-25 years without any kind of solution. And when the industries are discharging their waste into this common waste treatment plant, they have to pay for their treatment, because it costs money to treat their waste. So according to the load of waste that they are discharging, the industries have to pay. But this is actually a good solution for this problem which was there for the last 20-30 years. Now let's talk about the human-elephant conflict, which is also a major problem in Sri Lanka. Now in more recent times it is becoming a major issue in Sri Lanka, because one of the causes of the human-elephant conflict is unplanned development. Right? For example, we have very large development projects which are built on over elephant corridors. So you see that because elephants have they take a certain corridor. They go from place to place looking for food, and once they get used to a certain corridor, they always take that corridor. And what we are doing is, we are building all kinds of projects on top of that elephant corridor. Now the elephant is not going to change the way he goes from place to place, because they are used to that same corridor. So they always try to take that same corridor. And then only the human-elephant conflict starts, because the elephant is going through all these developed areas. So this is a major issue in Sri Lanka because of course we have to develop the country also, but we also have to keep in mind that we have to keep certain areas for the elephants if we want them to be there. So most of the time people are really blaming the wildlife conservation department because every time an elephant kills some person somewhere, they say what is the wildlife conservation department doing? They always blame the wildlife conservation department. But actually it's really beyond there. It's difficult for them to control this whole thing because there are so many other agencies which are doing huge large scale development projects, which is the cause of the human-elephant conflict. Now you have to know a little bit also about the regulatory functions of the Central Environmental Authority. Now as I told you, the National Environmental Act is the first comprehensive law in Sri Lanka for environmental management and protection. And the Central Environmental Authority was established to implement the provisions in this law. Now under this law, the Central Environmental Authority has two major regulatory functions. And the first one of this, of course, is called the Environmental Impact Assessment for large-scale projects. I'm sure all of you must have. How many of you have heard about Environmental Impact Assessment or EIA? Can you put up your hands? All of you have heard. Only one or two hands I don't see, so I think all of you must have heard except the people who are sleeping at home. Because I saw almost all the hands going up. So you have heard about Environmental Impact Assessment. So this is one of the major functions of the Central Environmental Authority. Then they also have another regulatory function which is called the Environmental Protection License. They give licenses for waste discharging industries in order to minimize the pollution by this industry. So these are the two major functions of the CEA, Central Environmental Authority. Now what is this Environmental Impact Assessment? Can someone tell me what is Environmental Impact Assessment? Can someone tell me? Now everybody has heard about it. Can you tell me what it is? Can one person tell? What is it used for? Talk. To assess the
negative or positive impact to the environment.
Yeah. Yes. That is the main negative and positive. That is good that you said that because people think it's always the negative things that you assess. You also assess the positive things from a project. So environmental impact assessment, it's actually one of the most powerful tools. You must have heard this concept of sustainable development. We are always talking about what we call sustainable development. You don't talk about just development, you are talking about sustainable development. And this environmental impact assessment is one of the most powerful tools in operationalizing this concept of sustainable development. And as he said correctly, environmental impact by doing environmental impact assessment on a project, you can assess what are one of the major things is to assess the negative, not only assess of course, you said assess the negative and positive impact. So the EIA, it definitely assesses the negative and positive impact, but it also says how you have to mitigate these problems. So that is what is called environmental impact assessment. You assess what is the negative impact and the positive impact of the project on the environment, and the environmental impact assessment report will also say how you can minimize those negative impacts and maybe maximize the positive impact. So that is what is environmental impact assessment or EIA. So environmental impact assessment is a planning tool which could go a long way in ensuring a sustainable development process. So what do you mean by sustainable development? Now in the past, people used to be always talking about development. they only talk about development. But they don't just simply talk about development now, they talk about what is called sustainable development. Can anyone tell me what is sustainable development? Anyone? In your opinion? I mean, you don't have to say the exact definition, but what does it kind of, what does it mean?
To ensure that not only the existing generation is benefited by the development, but also the future.
Yes. Yeah. So you have actually given the correct definition of, so that is actually the definition of sustainable development. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation, that is us, but also we cannot compromise the needs of the future generations. So normally in most countries which are highly developed today, like if you take the United States or Germany or any country like that, or Japan, they developed very, very fast after the war, right? At that time they were not talking about sustainable development, they only talked about development. So their industries etc. developed very, very fast, right? And they didn't actually give any attention to, there was no word called sustainable development at that time. So their only attention was on development, and they developed their industries very well, and they became highly industrialized countries. But actually they also suffered a lot in the process. For example, if you look at Japan, I think Japan is one of the countries which has suffered huge issues due to the industrialization process. How many of you have heard about the Minamata incident in Japan? Have you all heard about it? You have heard about it. Can you tell what it is?
Because of market poisoning.
Yeah.
There's no problem.
Yeah. So he said it correctly. In Japan, when they were developing very fast after the war, and there were no regulations at all on environment. Of course, you can't expect them to have that. But there were industries which are just discharging wastewater into any. I mean, there were no controls at all. And there was this one industry that was using mercury in its process. And they were discharging their wastewater into what is called the Minamata Bay. They were just discharging untreated wastewater into the Minamata Bay. And in the Minamata Bay, there were a lot of fish. And this fish, they accumulated this mercury. Now mercury is a heavy metal, as I told you. Heavy metals tend to accumulate in your body, right? And when this mercury containing wastewater was put into the Minamata Bay, the fish in that bay started accumulating this mercury in their bodies. And of course this Minamata Bay was a fishing area for people in that area. And they were catching fish from there and eating the fish. And after some years, they found that the people in that area were suffering really severe neurological problems. That is things to do with the brain and the central nervous system, because mercury affects the central nervous system, and it's a very severe poison to the central nervous system. So they found that thousands of people are poisoned by mercury. And they found even the second generation, the babies who were born, were severely, affected by mercury poisoning. And that company had to pay huge amounts in compensation for these people who were affected by mercury poisoning. So similarly, even in Japan, there was another case where they were discharging cadmium, which is also a heavy metal, and the cadmium got into the rice fields and got concentrated in the rice. And people who are eating this rice, they got affected by cadmium poisoning, and they were affected by, it was called the Itai disease, right? So both these happened in Japan. Then even in the United States, if you take the United States, even today there are huge areas that cannot be used by anybody. There are more than 1,000 sites which are highly contaminated with chemicals and radioactive waste, right? And the United States government, they had to create what was called a super fund, amounting to billions of dollars, just to clean up these contaminated areas. Because at that time there were not many regulations even in the United States. So that is what you call development. They just developed. But nowadays people go through what you call sustainable development. You don't just go ahead with development for the sake of development, but you develop in a way that is more sustainable, and also you don't waste all the resources for this generation, but you think of the next generation also. So this is what you call sustainable generation. Sustainable development. And environment impact assessment is one of the tools which could go a long way in ensuring a sustainable development process. So now in Sri Lanka, all major infrastructure projects as well as other major development projects now require an EIA prior to implementation, thereby ensuring that almost all adverse environmental impacts will be mitigated. So this is the importance of environmental impact assessment. And you do environmental impact assessment before you start the project. So before you start the project, you study what are the possible impacts from this project and how are you going to mitigate these issues that are going to come up. Now most people think this environmental impact assessment is a real headache for them, because they say that by trying to do EIA you are delaying a lot of projects. I have heard this complaint so many times, because they say now we want to do this project very quickly, but if you try to do an EIA, this project is going to get delayed by maybe 6 months or 1 year till you do the environmental impact assessment report. So that is true. That project might get delayed by maybe 6 months or 3 months or something like that, but in the end you will have a better project because it is a better planned project. So this is really an advantage of doing an environmental impact assessment of a project. And you find that in Sri Lanka actually, most of the time, especially in government projects, I have to say this, that they really sometimes they don't really do a proper feasibility study in many projects. I have seen that happening in, not the very large scale projects, really large scale projects they do feasibility studies, but in most medium scale projects, for example, if you are setting up industrial estate in some area, most of the time it's because the politician has wanted that industrial estate in his area. The officials just run and establish that industrial estate there. They don't even bother to see whether there is water for the industries or whether there is electricity or roads, because if you are going to have industries in a certain location, you have to ensure that there is sufficient water for those industries to operate. I have seen so many instances where they have started the industrial estate, and only when they are doing the environmental impact assessment, they are trying to figure out where is the water going to come from. Now, it's not the function of the environmental impact assessment to see where the water is going to come for the industrial estate. It should have been looked at much earlier than the EIA stage. It should have been looked at in the feasibility stage. Because if you are going to do a proper project, you have to do a feasibility study to see whether the project is actually feasible. So the environmental impact assessment comes very much later, but I have seen this happening many times. So I think in Sri Lanka actually, environmental impact assessment may look like a real delaying process, but most of the delays come because the project proponent has not done a proper feasibility study. If they had done a proper feasibility study, they would have found out that there is no water for this industry. So it doesn't have to come to the EIA stage to look into that issue. So most of the time, that is why these projects get delayed at the EIA stage, because they are looking at things which should have been looked at much earlier. Actually, the EIA process is very straightforward. If you write a proper report and all the facts are there, it's a very straightforward kind of process. But why it becomes so complicated is because they are looking at all the issues which should have been looked at much earlier within the EIA process. So what is the purpose of an EIA? The purpose of an EIA is to ensure that development plans or projects under consideration are environmentally sound and sustainable, and that it's a long sentence, but anyway, and that environmental consequences are recognized and taken into account early in the project design. So what is important is it's taken into account early in the project design. Before you start the project, you have to see what are the impacts of this project on the environment and how are you going to mitigate these problems on the environment. Now, if you look at most of the large-scale projects that have been implemented in Sri Lanka in recent time, for example, even the Norachole power plant, there also an environmental impact assessment was done. So all these projects, okay, there are other issues with the Norachole plant, but I don't think there are many environmental issues as such, because there was an impact assessment done, and at that stage they looked into all the potential environmental issues and actually had certain mitigation measures built into the project. So that is why, even though there's a huge coal power plant there, we don't hear of much pollution coming into other areas, because they have certain mitigation measures in place, because they did an environmental impact assessment and planned those things at the early stages of the project. And one other advantage is that when you do EIA, you plan the mitigation measures at the planning stage. So at the planning stage itself, you know if you are going to have to put air pollution control measures. Of course, it's going to cost money. And at that stage itself, you know that for this project we have to put in pollution control measures. So you build that into the project cost. So what happens in most times, why the pollution control doesn't happen is, at the feasibility stage or the planning stage, they don't look into what are the pollution control measures we have to put into this project. So then what happens is the project cost doesn't take into account the cost of the pollution control measures, and that can be quite a large amount. And then what happens, the project is finished. Then if you have to put in pollution control measures after the project is done, it becomes very much more expensive. Plus, of course, by that time the project proponent doesn't have any money for that purpose. So this is why it's very important that you have to plan these pollution control measures at the early stages of the project, not wait till the project is completed. So this is one of the advantages of doing an environmental impact assessment from the side of the project proponent, because you are going to take into consideration the environmental consequences of the project and also the mitigation measures that you have to put in and the cost of that mitigation measures. So then you will probably have some money set apart for that purpose in the project. So now if you look at the history of EIA in Sri Lanka, actually EIA really started in 1981. The legal provisions for EIA were included in the Coast Conservation Act number 57 of 1981, right? So the EIA process was not really started by the Central Environmental Authority, but it started with the Coast Conservation Department, right? Now you must have heard about this famous port city in Colombo that they are talking about in the newspaper almost every day. They have stopped that project at the moment, and the environmental impact assessment for that was done by the approval was given by the Coast Conservation Department, because the port city comes within the coastal zone. So any project that comes within the coastal zone, the environmental impact assessment has to be approved by the Coast Conservation Department and not the Central Environmental Authority. So any project that is coming outside the coastal zone has to be approved by the Central Environmental Authority. So this port city project is coming within the coastal zone, and therefore the approval is given by the Coast Conservation Department. So in 1988, I said that the National Environmental Act was amended, and only in 1988 that these regulations on EIA were brought into the National Environmental Act. So this is really the history of EIA in Sri Lanka. Now, when you talk about EIA, some people think that every project requires an environmental impact assessment. But the answer is that every project does not require an EIA. Right? Only so-called, what we call prescribed projects require EIA. So there are certain kinds of projects which the Central Environmental Authority has prescribed, and only those kind of projects require environmental impact assessment. And generally, these projects are very large scale kind of projects that require EIA. Every small scale tiny project does not need EIA. Then if you really want to know what these kind of projects are, you have to look at this Gazette notification 772/22 dated 24/6/93. So if you look at that Gazette notification, if you are doing some kind of project and you want to find out whether that project requires an EIA, you only have to look at this Gazette notification and you can make sure whether that project requires an EIA or not. So a total of 31 projects are listed as requiring EIA. So these are really large scale projects. Then of course in addition, now for example if you take hotel projects, only hotel projects which have more than 99 rooms require EIA. Hotels which have less than 99 rooms does not need an EIA. But if these projects, even if they are small, if they are situated in what we call environmentally sensitive areas, then you don't look at the scale of the project. For example, even if a 10-room hotel is trying to establish itself in an environmentally sensitive area, then the number of rooms doesn't matter. Even a 10-room hotel will require to undergo an environmental impact assessment. That is, if it is in an environmental sensitive area, right? So now EIA decision making. Now there are a lot of misconceptions about the EIA process. So people think that the EIA process is only effective only if it results in the rejection of projects, especially NGOs, of course. Environmental NGOs, they think that EIA process, when you are doing EIA, you have to keep on rejecting projects, that you shouldn't allow them to do any kind of project. So the purpose of EIA is not really to reject any projects. The purpose of EIA is to actually to plan, assist in the planning of a better project, right? So although the EIA process in Sri Lanka may have some weaknesses, it has definitely resulted in better planning of projects. So that I can say very confidently, because in the EIA process you are looking into all the aspects of the project, and in the process you are trying to make a better project, and you will ensure that the project does not cause environmental pollution or destruction of the environment. So although people may criticize the environmental impact assessment process, I think it has definitely helped in planning better projects in Sri Lanka. Now this is of course what I told you earlier, that many projects in Sri Lanka are politically driven. It is true. So there are many instances where we have seen projects where even the feasibility studies have not been done prior to implementation of major projects. Because some minister wants you to put up some project somewhere, and the officials just run around, they don't even do a proper feasibility study. The politician might say, I want an industrial estate here, or I want something else here. And of course as professionals, and especially if you are professional engineers, you are supposed to advise those politicians, because I think in Sri Lanka that's a major drawback of the professionals, as I can see. I have seen it in many government institutions. There are so-called professionals, but they never advise the politicians. I have seen this happening so many times. If a politician says you do this, they all just do it. They don't even open their mouths and tell anybody there is some issue here. Because as professionals, I think all of us have a duty to advise them, because politicians are not highly educated, or they don't know technical things. And I think it's a duty of all professionals that you should advise. I mean, it's difficult to do it, I know. With politicians, sometimes it's very difficult, but if you tell them it in the correct way, I have seen 99% of politicians will listen to it, but you have to say it in a certain way. You can't suddenly say at a crowded meeting you are saying something wrong. It's not the way to tell them, but there are certain ways of how you tell if they are doing something wrong. And if you know as a professional engineer or anybody, as a professional you know that what these people are trying to do is wrong. It is your duty to actually advise them that this is not the way to do it, but this is the way to do it, and why you are saying that. Because otherwise, I actually in my case, I never really blame the politicians for doing wrong things. Because I really blame the professionals in Sri Lanka. I have seen it so many times in my career in CEA that they never tell the politicians anything. They just simply carry out orders, and you can't really blame them because nobody has told them anything else. Maybe in those days they used to actually, the professionals used to advise, but nowadays I don't see that at all. And I also think most politicians will never do something if a professional person tells them, sir, you should not, this will happen if you do this. They will never do that. I have seen that. Because they don't want to take a risk, and because it's going to affect them in the later on. So as professional engineers, one advice, whoever is working in the government, one thing I can tell you is you have a duty to advise the politicians and even the higher-ups in your agencies. If they are trying to do something wrong and you know something professionally which they don't know, because as engineers you all must be having so much information that they are not professional engineers or they are not professional environmentalists or whatever. So you have to tell them, and I have seen them. For example, if you take even the airport in Veeravilla, there was a very big issue there that they were trying to put up this airport in the middle of 3 bird sanctuaries. So now most of the engineers, I have to tell you this, that they were asked to put that there, and most of the engineers who were in that agency, they just agreed and they just put it there. They didn't really look at the feasibility of putting an airport there. So it was later when it came to the EIA stage that they found that this site was a totally unsuitable site. But at that time, the president himself was told that this site is not a suitable site. And the president now, if the president can do it, I think other ministers also will listen. I mean, that's why the site was changed. But even the change site, there are certain, even now there are criticisms that that's not the best site. That is true, that may not be the best site. But it was a worse site that they were going to put up. So what I'm trying to say is, if you tell the politicians this is not correct, do it this way, they will definitely listen to you because you all are professionals and they are not. So this is one message that I would like to give during my lecture, because I think some of you might be working in government agencies. So now there are many instances where proper feasibility studies are not done prior to implementation of major projects. That is the truth really. And I think in that case you all should advise that you should do a feasibility study even to your politicians. So in such instances, the EIA procedure becomes part of the feasibility study in addition to the EIA. I have seen this happening many, many times. And this is not an ideal situation. There should be a feasibility study for any project. Otherwise, you are just wasting the money. I mean, of course, in the private sector, definitely they do feasibility studies because they are not going to dump a lot of money on a project unless they know that they are going to get something back. But in the government sector, because it's not our money or we don't feel it. A lot of people don't do proper feasibility studies before they do projects. So this is a very big shortcoming in Sri Lanka, which really has to be rectified. Now these are some of the examples which I have actually seen in my time that I was at the CA. There have been so many industrial estates. When it comes to the EIA stage, you find that there is no water source for any of the industries. And they come right up to the EIA stage to find that out. That should not have been so. Then there was this, they were going to put up the world's largest sulfuric acid factory. and the site that that particular ministry had selected was right next to a Ranaviru housing project. Right now, sulfuric acid factory is a very hazardous industry. I mean, anyone would know when you talk about sulfuric acid, even a layman will know that it is a hazardous industry. Now, this particular ministry selected a site right next to a Ranaviru housing scheme. So, only the Central Environmental Authority had to go through the EIA and tell them, you can't have this project here. And it took about 1 year because that Indian investor, he had to waste money for about 1 year, and then his EIA was rejected by the CA, so he couldn't do the industry, then he had to go away. And the same thing I was talking about, Veeravilla Airport in the middle of 3 bird sanctuaries. Now, if a proper feasibility study had been done, I don't think they would have suggested that particular site for that airport. Then there was another project that came sometime about 2 or 3 years ago, where they wanted to bring what is called a shipbreaking industry into the Trincomalee Bay area. Now, shipbreaking industry is one of the dirtiest industries that you can find in the whole world. Only in countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam you get shipbreaking industries, and even those countries are discontinuing this industry because it's so dirty and it's polluting the coastline so much. So actually there was a proposal to bring in one of these industries into the Trincomalee Bay area, which is one of the most sensitive bays that you can find in even the world actually. So all of the above projects should have been rejected long before the EIA process. So all these projects came into the EIA stage. This is what I am trying to say, that these projects should have been rejected at the beginning itself without going through EIA. So this is now mostly for government agencies, of course. Many agencies do not make the decisions which are possible under their own legislation, but await the decision of the EIA. Now, for example, that Ranaviru, that sulfuric acid factory could have been rejected at the beginning itself. No, they brought it to the CA and had to go through a EIA to reject it. Right? Same with the Veeravilla Airport. They went through the whole process, and so the project got delayed by about 2 or 3 years because that EIA was rejected, then they had to find another site. So this is what I am saying. So this can cost a lot in terms of money and also time for the project proponent. So your project gets delayed by so many years when you don't do a proper feasibility study and just jump into the EIA stage. So issues such as water availability for the project, then siting issues, land issues, risk assessments, zoning issues, legal issues are all addressed through the environmental impact assessment process. So they should all be addressed actually at the EIA stage, at the feasibility stage. So now, as a result of this, the EIA process is blamed for delay in projects, slowing down development in the country, and for the rejection of good projects. So finally they blame the EIA process for rejection of all these projects. But actually these projects haven't been rejected because of the EIA. They should have been rejected long before the EIA. But of course finally the EIA gets the bad name. In fact, if you actually analyze the rate of rejection of projects under the EIA process, it's only about 2% of the projects that get rejected after EIA. So all the other 98% of projects go through, and also they become better projects because of the EIA process. So the main purpose of EIA is not the approval or rejection of projects, but to ensure that projects which are proposed go ahead with minimum damage to the environment. So that is the purpose of environmental impact assessment. So now, when you talk about decision making in EIA, it is very important in EIA decision making not to resort to emotional decision making, but to be very analytical and scientific in assessing the magnitude of the impact on the environment as well as the possibility otherwise of mitigating such impacts. So what I mean by emotional decision making is Most of the time in Sri Lanka, if a lot of people are complaining, we tend to listen to what those people are saying. They may not exactly be scientific, or they may be just complaining. For example, now Ratupaswala was a classic case where emotional decision making was taken, and it may not have been a scientific decision making process. Now there is some argument about this banning of glyphosate. There's a pesticide that has been banned. A lot of scientists are now saying that this glyphosate was banned because it was causing the kidney disease in Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa district. So basically the decision was taken to ban the glyphosate because of that. But a lot of eminent scientists are saying that there is no real proof of that it is this glyphosate that is causing this kidney disease. But anyway, it has been banned, and there can be many impacts on agriculture in Sri Lanka. So sometimes we do emotional decision making, which can be quite dangerous. And even in Ratupaswala, it was a case of emotional decision making, which is why that $1 million foreign exchange earning industry had to relocate. Of course, they are doing very well now, so it doesn't really matter. But we have to be very careful that decisions are made in a scientific manner. Now, when you talk about impact mitigation, also we cannot and should not take the stand that all possible impacts from a project should be 100% mitigated. It is not possible. Obviously, there are going to be some impacts on the environment from a project. So we are not looking to see whether all the impacts are 100% mitigated. We are not looking at that. And neither should we expect the EIA report to study every single impact that arises from a project in great detail. So one of the issues that we find in EIA reports in Sri Lanka is they are trying to study every single thing that happens due to that project. One of the major things about EIA is you are only supposed to study the major impacts of a project. You are supposed to focus on the major impacts, and you are supposed to focus on mitigation of major impacts. You are not supposed to study every single thing that happens because of the project. Because by doing that, you are taking attention from the major impacts. I don't think you need all this because these are just details of the EIA report. So the main purpose of an EIA report is to assist in the decision making process. And the main part of the EIA which assists in decision making is the quantification of the project impacts and the level of mitigation possible, and an analysis of project's impacts on the environment and its consequences, if any. So this is the main purpose of an EIA report. So EIA reports are expected to be concise reports with adequate information for decision making. So, but if you look at the EIA reports in Sri Lanka, they are generally very academic kind of reports. So they copy from some book or the other, or from some old EIA report, and they write long rigmaroles, whereas EIA reports are supposed to making decisions easier for the decision maker. He doesn't have time to read 2,000 pages of a EIA report. Actually, most of the EIA reports in Sri Lanka are really bad, because we have a tendency in Sri Lanka to think that a report is good if it has 2,500 pages. But a report is good if it has 250 pages, but it has all the information. I have seen the best EIA report that I have seen in the Central Environmental Authority was about 100 pages big. But it had everything that it required. Whereas I have seen reports with also 3,000 pages where you can't make anything out of it because it's so long. And you know that the person who is writing is confused himself. Or either he is copying from some book or writing from some earlier EIA report. He himself doesn't know what he is writing. So if you write a very brief, concise report, you know that and the report is good, you know that the person knows what he is talking about. And it's very easy for a decision maker when you see a report like that. You don't want to read all these long academic things because it's supposed to be a very practical kind of report. So I don't think you need to know about all these problems with EIA, etc. So this I must say, now most of the EIA reports in Sri Lanka have very good, they describe the environment very well because it's very easy to do. You know, you say the air quality is like this, the water quality is like this, there are trees like this, there is something like this. So their description of the environment is very good in the EIA report, right? And the project details are also very good because that information is very easy to get for them, right? You just copy it from the project report or, you know, even the environment, you can just get it from somewhere. But when it comes to the major part of the EIA, which is what are the impacts from this project on the environment and how are you going to mitigate? Now that part is always the worst part in all EIA reports because basically either they don't know what are the impacts or it's much more difficult to write that part of the EIA report. But you have to remember that that is the most crucial part of the EIA report. In most EIA reports, this is the worst part of the report. So both reports have no proper analysis of the impacts of the project on the environment. So these are huge problems in some of the EIA reports that we get in Sri Lanka. So as I told you earlier, a 1,500-page report discussing mostly the project details, the existing environment around the project, and long details about minor impacts which could be ignored is less valuable than a 100-page report which accurately analyzes the possible impacts of the project and their magnitudes and the extent of mitigation. So it's not the number of pages of the report that is important, but what is in that report and how you write it. Yeah, this of course I don't think you need. So conclusion, okay. So the EIA process is meant to assist in the decision making process, and EIA reports are not meant to confuse this. This is what most of the reports do. They confuse with so many details, with unnecessary details, but give a clear, concise analysis of the project, impacts on the environment, and the extent to which they could be mitigated, and details of impacts. There are some impacts that you can't mitigate. So the EIA report must say, you have to be also truthful in EIA reports. You can't just lie and say, oh, all these impacts can be mitigated. There are some impacts which cannot be mitigated. So you have to tell the truth in the EIA report and say, this particular impact cannot be mitigated, but it is there. So that is the purpose of EIA reports. So many project proponents look at EIA as a hurdle to development because they think it slows down development. But you have to look at EIA in a positive way because it assists in the planning of a better project. So as engineers, EIA can be made use of to plan a better project overall. So planning of project, now this is also important because you all are engineers, right? Engineers involved in project planning should also look into environmental aspects during the planning stage. This doesn't happen in most of the cases that I have seen. Especially in government projects, I have seen so many irrigation projects. The engineers are, drawing irrigation projects, they are drawing engineering plans, everything, and the whole project is going through. They are putting a huge reservoir within a national park or a forest, conservation forest. They haven't looked at it at the planning stage. And when it comes to the EIA state, now this huge reservoir is coming and 3,000 hectares of prime forest land is going to be destroyed. Now actually as engineers, you should look into those issues. I mean, you can't say this reservoir can be put only in this. I'm sure there are other ways in which to, there are many ways in which to put a reservoir and many locations. But most of the time I see, they only look at, they have a plan in their head and they don't bother to see where this reservoir is coming. So then what happens is when it comes to the EIA state, the forest department comes and says, no, we cannot let this project go ahead because 3,000 acres of a national park or a forest area is going underwater, so we can't allow it. And then that project gets delayed for years and years because the forest department and maybe the irrigation department or highway department or whoever is planning the project is arguing between them. I have seen this happening so many times. So as engineers, what I am trying to tell you is, especially in the government sector, of course, if you are planning a project, please talk to these agencies. As I told you earlier, between the forest department and the wildlife department, they are controlling 1.9 million hectares in the country. So your project is, if your project is a huge irrigation project or a highway project, it's bound to go through some of these these wildlife areas or forest areas. So what I am trying to say is, at the feasibility stage itself, if you find that this area is a forest department area or a wildlife area, talk to those agencies. Don't keep them in the dark, and they only at the last minute the wildlife department knows that this project is going through their wildlife, and they are not going to allow it, because just like you have a mandate to do irrigation projects or roads, they have a mandate to protect the forests and the wildlife parks. So they are doing their job just like how you are doing your job. So what I am trying to say is, when you are planning the job itself, talk to them, and it will make your project very much easier. So then you can look at alternate project designs, or you can do certain, you always have ways and means of getting the same result from a different kind of design. So this is what I am saying, that engineers should actually talk to this. Don't think that environment is less important than the engineering project, because most of the time that is what happens. Because the people think that environment is secondary to everything else. But finally, because of the environment, the project gets stopped or delayed. I know it has happened so many times. So during the feasibility and planning stage, issues such as loss of forest cover and impacts on wildlife should be considered in addition to engineering aspect. So I don't think you can decide what are these impacts, but you should talk to the agencies that know those impacts. If you talk to the forest department and if 3,000 hectares are going to be destroyed, you will have to talk to them at the beginning itself, because it's difficult to change a plan. Once you have finalized the plan and you come to the EIA stage, it's very difficult for you to change that plan, because the forest department is saying, no, we can't allow this pipeline to go from this national park, or we can't have this reservoir here, and by that time you have finished your designs and everything, and so again you have to go back and change your design. So it delays the project by another at least 1 year. So this is one advice that I can give you, because I have seen this happening many times. So there are many irrigation and water supply projects planned, especially in the northern area. And these are very useful projects. No one is saying that these are, definitely we need these projects because it's giving water to the north, or water supply schemes, etc. But these projects are getting delayed because they are definitely going through these forest areas and wildlife areas, and because of that these projects are getting delayed, because those agencies are saying we can't, they are bringing up various objections to the projects. So if you planned it with those agencies from the beginning, those projects would have gone ahead without any kind of issue. So during the project planning and feasibility stage, it is very important for the engineering professionals to have close consultation and discussion with conservation agencies such as the Forest Department and Department of Wildlife Conservation in order to address the issues they may have. So this is what I've been telling. So in many projects in Sri Lanka, agencies such as Forest Department and Department of Wildlife Conservation get to know about the projects only at the EIA stage. So they are hearing about this project for the first time when they come to the CA for the EIA meeting. This is too late in the project cycle, and many projects get delayed due to this reason. This is what I was talking about. So now pollution control also, now Central Environmental Authority is also involved in pollution control. I won't go into details, of course. So the CA also involved in the control of water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution and hazardous waste management. So those are the areas that CA is involved in. So one of the major impacts of industries on the environment is the discharge of wastewater, which causes water pollution in water bodies such as rivers, lakes, lagoons, as well as the ocean. So in order to control such pollution, the CA has specified certain standards which are required to be met by industries when discharging their waste effluent. So this is what I told you at the beginning. They can't just simply discharge their wastewater into rivers and lakes or into the sea. They have to treat it up to certain standards that have been gazetted by the CA. Then the CA controls pollution from industry through a process of issuing an environmental protection license for industry. So the CA issues what we call the EPL or environmental protection license. The EPL issued to an industry stipulates the standards and criteria to be met by the industry during its operation and during the discharge of effluents and noise. So they even stipulate the noise level that an industry can discharge. So and if the industry violates any of the conditions in this environmental protection license, the CA can file legal action against the industry. So this is a legal procedure and the industry is legally bound to meet the standards that are specified by the Central Environmental Authority. And if they violate any of the standards, the CA can take them to courts. Then the control of water pollution, the standards stipulated by the CA specifies the level of pollutants which are allowed to be discharged into the environment. So CA will specify the amount of pollutants which can be in the wastewater. For example, there is a parameter called biological oxygen demand or BOD, which measures the pollutant load of wastewater. So when you measure the BOD of a wastewater from an industry, you can say how polluting that wastewater is. And the CA has specified a BOD level of 30 milligrams per litre for wastewater which are discharged into inland waterways, that is into rivers or lakes. So this is how pollution is being controlled. So if you have a 30 BOD level, then there will be no pollution occurring of the water body. So in addition, chemicals such as mercury, chromium, lead, now these are heavy metals that I talked about which are very toxic to humans. They are not allowed to be present in the wastewater, or very, very small, tiny amounts are allowed to be present in the not even ppm levels, because these can cause severe pollution of water bodies. So in the standard CA standards, you can see mercury, chromium, lead. You can allow only very tiny quantities are allowed to be in the wastewater. These precautions have been taken in order to prevent situations such as the Minamata incident and the Itai disease in Japan, which I was talking about earlier. So there is also a misconception that the standards specified by the CA are too stringent for a country like Sri Lanka. So we hear this all the time from industry that our standards are too strict. But actually, if you compare the standards that are used in Sri Lanka, they are very similar to the standards which have been used in Thailand or India or any of the countries in the region. So there is no truth to the saying that these standards are very strict. So, but of course, there is, however, an urgent need for low-cost pollution control technology for waste treatment in Sri Lanka. Right? For example, now the ITI or the CISIR, they developed a low-cost method for treatment of wastewater from service stations. Right? This ITI, their method, the cost of the ITI method that ITI developed was only 200,000 rupees. Right? Whereas the same, one of the universities in Sri Lanka developed a method for treatment of this wastewater from service station, which cost 5 million rupees. So you can see, if you tell an industry, if you tell a service station owner, put up this treatment plant for 5 million, they are never going to do that. But if you tell them, okay, you put up this treatment method for 2 lakhs, they will definitely do it. So in Sri Lanka, there is definitely a need for low-cost pollution control technology, because most of the industries we have are small and medium-scale industries which can't spend huge amounts on pollution control. Now coming on to the control of air pollution. So as I told you, a major human health hazard in urban areas is air pollution caused by vehicular emissions. So the major air pollutants which are causing human health hazard are sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide and oxides of nitrogen. So those are the pollutants that we get from vehicles. So these air pollutants, especially if you take sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen, they can cause major health problems in people unless they are kept in problem. So in the past, of course, there was a major problem caused by lead that was used in the petrol. As a anti-knock agent, they were using lead. But now, of course, they have phased it out, and lead is also a very toxic chemical which can actually cause mental retardation in children under 5. So fortunately for us, now the lead is not being used in the petrol, so the pollution levels are actually not very high. So in diesel vehicles, the major pollutants from diesel vehicles are sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, hydrocarbons and particulates or dust particles. Then in petrol vehicles you used to get lead, now you don't get it. Then you get aromatics, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, oxides of nitrogen and suspended particulate matter. So similarly, you can get air pollutants from industries and thermal power plants. So the main pollutants from these are sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen. So in addition to that, of course, these coal power plants emit other things like even mercury is emitted from coal power plants. So they are quite polluting, although we have it. So these are some of the effects of air pollution. As I told you, there are major health effects of these chemicals that have been emitted by vehicles. Then you also get acid rain from sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen. When it dissolves in the rain, it causes it forms sulfuric acid and nitric acid, which causes acid rain. So you can get acid rain, and due to the effects of acid rain, you can get huge impacts on buildings. Then you get smog formation and also damage to crops. So these are some of the issues with regard to air pollution. Then we also have the greenhouse effect. You must have heard about the greenhouse effect or global warming, which everyone is talking about now. And global warming is caused mainly due to the effects of carbon dioxide. And also there are other gases like nitrous oxides and methane, which also contribute to global warming. So now this global warming is a huge issue at the moment. Now similarly, some years back, we had this global environmental problem of ozone depletion. The ozone in the stratosphere was getting depleted due to the emissions of chlorofluorocarbons. But now, most of the countries have now phased out using these chlorofluorocarbons, and now they find that there was a huge big hole in the Arctic, I think, in the ozone layer. But now they find that it is getting smaller and smaller because these CFCs have been now banned by most countries. So the ozone depletion problem is getting solved because of the action by all the countries, but the global warming problem is still going on because none of the countries seem to take any action regarding that. So this is one of the issues that we have in there's a whole lot of more things. I don't think I will go through all that because almost the time is up. Unless you all have any questions about air pollution, I will now take the rest of the 10 minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Yeah.
You were talking about the
Yeah.
What about the COD? What's the difference between COD and
COD means, now BOD measures only the biodegradable pollutants. COD measures the load of chemicals also in there. So COD is generally always higher than the COD is a measure of the biodegradable part as well as the chemical pollutants. So generally COD is always higher than the BOD level. Does it answer your question?
what was the limit?
COD I think it's 250 or something. 250. I can't exactly remember, but I think it's 250. Of course, it depends. Even the BOD level is 30 only when you are discharging into rivers and lakes. So if you are discharging into the sea, they allow a BOD level which is higher. So depending on where you are discharging the wastewater, the BOD and COD level will change. So the CA has different standards. If you are discharging into a river, they have a different standard. If you are discharging into the sea, they have a different standard. Then if you are discharging on, you are also allowed, certain types of waste are allowed to be discharged on land. Then they have a different BOD and COD level. It depends on where you are discharging. Any other questions? No more questions. Comments?
Excuse me. The private sectors normally are getting ISO 14,000.
ISO 14,000.
As well as nowadays people are constructing buildings under green.
Yeah.
So what is the influence in the environment impact assessment? Initially we are going to do the environment impact assessment.
Yeah.
After they are going for the green and ISO 14,000.
Yeah.
So what is the difference in that?
Connection between the two. When they give you the ISO 14,000 standard, when they register you with that, they look at all the regulatory requirements. They see whether the industry has followed all the environmental regulations in the country. So now if your industry, according to the law in the environmental law in the country, if your industry has to go through an EIA, and if your industry has to get an environmental protection license, the people who are auditing the industry in order to give the ISO 14,000 will see whether you have gone through an EIA and whether you have got the approval and whether you have got the EPL and whether you have a valid EPL. All those things will be looked at when they are giving that ISO 14,000 standard. Does it answer your question?
Yes, sir. Now, anyway, now environment impact assessment is from 1988. But so many companies in Sri Lanka,
Yeah.
and that time they have not done that.
They haven't done those.
Now they
Can't. Now there's no point trying to do EIA now.
Everybody, so many companies are now in the residential area. And some companies, when they started, there was no residential.
That's true, yes.
After it was started.
It's very difficult to give a solution to that. It's almost impossible. Either you have to relocate the industries or you have to relocate the residents. That is why we say in the high polluting industries should go into industrial estates.
Other question is, you know that as professional engineers, we should make care of politicians.
Yeah.
Now see the situation in Ilpa.
Yes.
There's big issues is going on. How many professionals are there? Who is respect professional people? So they are respect for us. But the idea we are saying maybe it's a genuine thing.
Yeah.
They don't care.
Who doesn't care?
Politicians. And job roles are a risk too.
No, I don't think so. Because even in the Vilpattu, what did he said that don't ask me, ask the officials who are given the land. It is the officials who are given finally release the land. Because politicians don't have any power to release land anyway. The laws don't say this politician, any law, right? Though you say that the politician has released, finally if that land has been released, it has to be an official who has released it is not the politician because he doesn't have power to release land. But he can tell the official to release the land. That way I don't know whether he did or not. I don't know. But finally it is obviously if the land has been released, it has been done by an official. Because no politician has power to release land. from the laws that I know in Sri Lanka, either the Forest Department law or the Central Environmental Law or Wildlife Law, no politician has powers to issue. I mean, they don't have the power to issue release land. But they can instruct someone to do it. So in which case, if it was illegal, the officials should not have done it. That is all I am saying. I can assure you that politicians have no power to do that legally. But all the time they instruct people to do that. So I don't know in this case what happened. I have no idea what has happened. So if they have released land, definitely the officials who have released the land have to be responsible. This is why I say I never blame politicians. You should look into that. I don't know exactly, so I can't really tell you what has happened there. But from what I know, I have studied these laws, I know that there is no power for any politician to release land. They have to do it through some official, because only officials have been given power to release land. Either divisional secretaries, or if it's the Forest Department, the conservator of forests, somebody like that has to release the land. Politicians can't release land.
You are referring to weakness of EIA.
What is that?
You are saying department like that. There may be some of the weaknesses of EIA.
Some of the?
There may be some of the weaknesses of EIA.
Yes.
What do you really
Weaknesses of EIA reports is a big problem. I told you about.
Sorry, EIA system.
EIA system. Yes, some of the there are a lot of weaknesses in the sense that, well, I think I have written it here. I can't just offhand tell you. But one of the major weaknesses is the EIA reports. Most of them are really bad EIA reports, right? Because in other countries they focus on the issues. When you take a project, right? And one of the weaknesses we have, I can tell you that now we have technical evaluation committees who evaluate these EIA reports. And sometimes the technical evaluation committee has a lot of, we have a lot of very highly educated people, professionals and university professors, etc. But sometimes I find that they don't always focus on the issues, because they are doing theoretical things. Whereas the environmental impact assessment is supposed to be a very kind of practical kind of thing. So now when you are evaluating environmental impacts of a report, of a project, you are supposed to look at that project in a highly practical way, not look at things which are in books and theses. Right? Sometimes the technical evaluation committee can have members who are highly theoretical, and it's not always possible to do projects in this highly theoretical way in which books are written. So you have to have very practical but knowledgeable people in the EIA. That's one of the major weaknesses I can see even in the EIA process. But there is a problem there because we don't have many experts in Sri Lanka. If you take an expert in geology or expert in air pollution, you don't find many highly knowledgeable experts in Sri Lanka. We have very few really. So sometimes you have to depend on university academics, and sometimes they can be very academic. And what you need in a EIA evaluation is not academic, academic kind of evaluation. You need very practical kind of evaluation. So that is one of the major weaknesses, in addition to many other weaknesses. Yes. Uma project, I don't know. I mean, I can't give because I have to study that to tell you. All those issues that have come up now have been identified in the EIA report. I have talked to the EIA director herself, and she told me that all those issues that have come up now have been identified in the EIA report, and the project proponent has been asked to look into those issues carefully. Politicians have nothing to do with it. Politicians have nothing to do with it. Now there also, this is what I am saying, now you are pointing the finger at the politician. But politicians, I mean, they may have wanted the project expedited, that is true. I think politicians may have wanted the project to be done quickly. Right? But they didn't say don't follow the conditions given by the CA, don't do the studies. So there may have been an issue when you try to expedite projects also. Sometimes you can't do all the precautions, that is true. To that I agree. But there also I think the professionals should have advised and said, if you do this, this might happen. Because in the EIA report it has clearly said, in the EIA approval conditions also they have clearly said, do this, do this, do this. So all these issues that came up later, they have said, they have identified. So I don't think you can blame politicians for that. No. I'm sorry, I blame the professionals who are in charge. Why didn't they tell the politicians? I mean, if you tell the politicians, okay, sir, there's going to be, I mean, I don't know whether you can predict leaks and all that, I don't know whether there is any, but they identify certain geological formations and all where there can be weaknesses. Those were identified. And they were told to do studies on those. So I don't know whether they did or not. So now they are blaming the EIA report. It's not the EIA report that's at fault, it's the feasibility report that's at fault, not the EIA report. It's not the job of the EIA report to do the feasibility study, no? They should have done a proper feasibility study. Yeah, he may have given the wrong solution, but he gave the wrong idea. But anyway, it was a good solution because now they are inside the industrial estate and that's okay. Politicians give solutions, that is true, but sometimes if you advise them, they might give the right solution. The problem is we don't talk to them, no? We are so scared of them that whenever they say something, we agree to whatever they say. I think that's a major issue in Sri Lanka. That's not being a professional. So if that's all, we can stop here if there are no more questions.